On the 23rd of August 1914, after hours of brutal fighting, hundreds of German soldiers converged from all directions on a bruised and bleeding soldier manning a bullet-riddled machine gun, the last of the rearguard of the British Expeditionary Force. That man, Private Sidney Godley, and the many fallen comrades who lay nearby had performed the impossible and checked the mighty Schlieffen Plan. This is the story of the Battle of Mons. So how did the British find themselves in Belgium in the summer of 1914? Well, it's an often told and fairly complex story, but in short, ever since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo that June, Europe had been set on a path for war. The British at first had been unsure whether to commit, but all that changed when in early August the Germans launched their famous Schlieffen Plan. In its most simple form, German High Command knew that if a major war was declared in Europe, they would likely end up fighting on two fronts against both the French and Russians. Desperate to avoid this at all costs, the Schlieffen Plan was born, an attempt to destroy the French in just 6 weeks before then turning their entire military might eastwards to engage the Russians. This plan meant attacking the French from both east and north, including through neutral Belgium. And because Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, when that attack came, she too was bound to join the fight. That's why in early August a small but highly professional army known as the British Expeditionary Force would cross the English Channel to take up the fight. Let's take a look at the BEF. In truth, that early force was perilously small, at just 100,000 men. Commanded by Field Marshal Sir John French, it was split into two corps, the first under General Sir Douglas Haig and the second under General Sir Horace Lockwood Smith-Dorrien. The main fighting in the battle to come, and so our focus for this video would be by the men of the 3rd Infantry Division of the 2nd Corps, more specifically 2 battalions who would hold the point of greatest danger. First is the 4th Battalion Middlesex Regiment, a pre-war regular army battalion raised mainly from the London area. Affectionately known as the Die Hards, after a famous episode in the Peninsular War when the badly wounded commander of the then 57th famously shouted, "Die hard, 57th, die hard," as the men advanced into the attack, a reputation they would continue to deserve in the Great War. In the same division's 9th Brigade were the 4th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, another London-based unit with a formidable reputation. Amongst their ranks in 1914 was Lieutenant Maurice Dease, a 24-year-old professional soldier from a wealthy family in County Westmeath, Ireland. He joined the army in 1909 and on the outbreak of war commanded the machine gun section of the 4th Fusiliers. Under his command was one Private Sidney Godley. Born in Sussex but raised in London, he'd worked for an ironmonger before joining the army in 1910. And whilst Dease had once said that Godley was the least technically proficient soldier in his section, he certainly made up for it in sheer determination. Sid had celebrated his 25th birthday 3 days after arriving in France. Just a final quick point about British infantry in 1914. It was, by most estimates, man for man, the best trained infantry force in the world. As Europe's only entirely professional army, other nations employing conscription, the BEF prided itself on marksmanship, fieldcraft and resilience in the fight. That said, it was in 1914 a pitifully small force, especially when we consider what was coming its way. Those approaching enemy formed part of the German First Army under General Alexander von Kluck. Thus far, they had only been lightly opposed, and now as they descended from the north with more than 375,000 men, they were about to run into the unsuspecting BEF. In truth, by the time the British arrived in mainland Europe in reasonable numbers, the situation was already desperate. Those early German moves had shattered the Belgian national redoubt system, capturing Liège and Brussels and driving the Belgian field army towards Antwerp. With the route ahead clear, the scythe of the Schlieffen Plan could swing southwards to envelop the French from the north. At about the same time, the British were advancing to join the fight, but unsure of where the enemy was and in what strength, Sir John French decided to head for Brussels. It was whilst on that march, on the night of the 22nd of August, that everything changed. Learning that the French army on his right flank had been smashed that day at the Battle of Charleroi, and that they were falling back under tremendous pressure, he was left with a difficult choice. If he withdrew his forces, the German army would envelop the entire Allied position, falling on the open French flank and destroying them in detail. If, on the other hand, the British held their ground, they themselves risked being outflanked and annihilated in their very first fight. The only option was to deal a checking blow to the enemy, holding long enough for the French to withdraw, but not so long that they themselves would be surrounded. It was a very difficult task, and for very high stakes. Despite the risks, Sir John French committed to hold the enemy right here, near the little-known town of Mons, for a period of 24 hours. Let's take a closer look. The area he would hold covered this 16-mile stretch of the west-east running Mons-Condé Canal, an industrial waterway serving the coal mining industry that dominated this part of Belgium. Anchoring his defences on the southern side, he aimed to deploy his forces to check the enemy advance at key points along its frontage. With 18 bridges crossing the canal, he had hoped to destroy them all, but in the rush to prepare, not enough explosives could be found, and so several key crossing points remained. The major risk though, and our focus, was to be found on the right of the British line, in this area, known as the Nimy salient. Moving in closer, we can understand why it was so dangerous. Here the canal made a distinctive curve between the village of Oberg for about 2 miles to the village of Nimy in the west. Here the shape of the canal itself meant that the approaching Germans could attack from multiple directions, forcing a crossing and advance through Mons itself into the open ground beyond. We should remember that the men given the task of defending this area were already very tired when they arrived at Mons, having marched 20 miles each day in scorching summer weather just to reach the town, with the men of the Royal Fusiliers captured in this famous photo in the old town square shortly before moving down to the canal. Let's take a look at their positions. Given the job of holding the left or western part of the Nimy salient were the 4th Royal Fusiliers. Here the troops moved up to the houses along the southern edge of the canal, where they began occupying gardens and hedge lines, knocking loopholes in walls and buildings, each with line of sight over the canal. The key danger point was here, the Nimy rail bridge. As a heavy goods crossing which would allow the passage of artillery, it was essential for the Germans to capture it, and much easier than crossing the 60-foot wide canal, which, by the way, was about half as narrow as it is today. Because of this, the Fusiliers had sighted their only 2 Vickers Maxim machine guns either side of the bridge to defend its approaches. Amongst those men were Lieutenant Dease and Sidney Godley, who hurriedly built up a barricade of coal sacks to offer at least some protection from enemy fire. A little further down, and also of concern, was an old-fashioned swing bridge in the middle of the canal. One of the first actions of the defenders was to close it to block off any crossing from this direction. Holding the right side of the Nimy salient, with their defences anchored around the rail station at the village of Oberg, were the men of the 4th Middlesex. They too had a precarious position to hold. Not only did they need to defend another bridge crossing right here, but they also had a largely open right flank, defended only by a thin screen of infantry on the edge of this wood line. One key point in this sector was the railway station building itself, which occupied this spot, on the roof of which the best marksmen of the battalion had been placed. By the early hours of the 23rd of August, in mist and light rain, the defenders were in place and peered across the canal for the first sight of the advancing enemy. Somewhat surprisingly, the Germans had very little idea that the British were in front of them when they emerged to begin their advance around 8 AM. Watching on from the loopholed walls, house windows and the roof of Oberg Station, the diehards held their fire as the enemy drew closer. 23-year-old Lance Corporal Alfred Vivian recalled the following moments.
A solid phalanx advanced upon our defences in massed formation from the wood. It was an awe-inspiring spectacle. We were ordered to hold fire until they were 50 yards from the canal bank. Then the order came. The solid-looking field grey wall was blasted away by the hail that leapt at them. No troops on earth could have faced that murderous blast and resisted. They were completely shattered and thrown back to their starting point.
The shock of that ferocious first blow wouldn't last, and quickly regrouping, the German advance began again, this time with far more caution and under the cover of a withering fire from machine guns on the far bank of the canal. Over the next hour, the Germans advanced again and again, each time being repulsed with huge losses, but also taking a heavy toll on the defenders. By 10 AM, the German artillery had arrived beyond the woods to the north, and added to the crack and buzz of bullets were the explosions of 77mm shells which slammed into the occupied buildings and further dwindled the defenders' numbers. Despite that ever-increasing fire, the Middlesex held on, checking every attempt to cross the canal and advance through Oberg. The situation though changed around midday, when more German troops working to the east of Oberg found an unopposed passage across the canal, and pouring through in tens, then hundreds and eventually thousands, they soon brushed aside the thin skirmish line guarding the Middlesex right flank. By 12:30 the situation at Oberg was desperate. Hit now by fire from front and flank, it was clear that the defence couldn't hold. But to abandon those positions would allow the Germans to rush the bridge and swarm the defenders. A delaying action was needed. The exact sequence of what followed is unclear, but it is known that at least one man, positioned on the station roof, volunteered to stay behind. His accurate fire and stubborn resistance held the Germans at bay for a few vital minutes whilst his comrades withdrew. Eventually that last resistance was crushed when a salvo of artillery destroyed the station building and the lone marksman who had fought to the last. Today the site of that building and the story of the unknown soldier who gave his life here in August 1914 is commemorated by a plaque erected by the local population recalling those events. By the time the Middlesex had got clear of Oberg and began yet another holding action to prevent the British flank from being rolled up, another bitter fight was underway 2 miles away at Nimy. The first Germans had appeared across the canal in this sector around 10:30 AM, a little later than at Oberg, though the sounds of that fight made it clear to the waiting defenders exactly what was approaching. Here on the southern end of the Nimy rail bridge, Lieutenant Dease readied his men. His 2 machine guns were by now well in place, with strong fields of fire but also very exposed. Either side of him were riflemen, waiting for the first enemy to come into view. Just before 11 AM the battle opened, but this time there was no surprise. Artillery, machine gun and rifle fire swept the defenders' positions as the first rush was made at the bridge. Directing his machine guns into action, Lieutenant Dease put them immediately to deadly use. Under a withering return fire, the first attack failed, leaving a scattering of men at the far end of the bridge. But their positions now clear, the Germans brought a hail of fire down onto Dease and his men. Over the next 90 minutes, a fierce duel broke out in which both sides took heavy losses, but with those 2 machine guns still in action and riflemen firing all along the canal, the enemy still couldn't make the much-needed breakthrough. The finely balanced battle would finally begin to swing in the Germans' favour when one of the 2 emplaced guns on the bridge, riddled with bullets and with its crew killed or wounded, was put out of action, considerably diminishing the return fire. By now, the riflemen too were perilously low on ammunition, and with ever more enemy appearing on the far side of the canal and no sign of the Middlesex to their right, the situation was dire. It was clear that the Fusiliers couldn't hold, and yet another last stand was required to save the remnants of the battalion. It was then that Dease and Godley stepped forward, volunteering to cover the withdrawal. At about this very time, a few hundred yards further down the canal, the Germans were mustering for another attack. Unable to cross here as the swing bridge had been closed, and with the controls to open it on the British side of the canal, one man, Musketeer Oskar Neymeyer, stepped forward. Plunging into the canal under constant rifle fire, he swam to the far side, climbed up and single-handedly wound the bridge round, locking it open in place. At the very moment of victory, that brave German soldier fell dead, but crucially, a new route across the canal had been secured. Back at the rail bridge, the writing was on the wall. As the last few men slipped away to the south, Lieutenant Dease, limping and bleeding from a leg wound, settled behind the last remaining machine gun with Private Godley by his side. Now the Germans had only one single target left on the far bank, and a murderous fire was poured onto the gun from all directions. Oblivious to the hail of lead striking around him, Dease fired on, being hit in the abdomen, neck and a glancing shot to the head. Incredibly, he kept firing until, struck in the chest, he slumped dead over his gun. With Germans now just yards away to his front and right, Private Godley took over. Traversing the gun and pouring a stream of bullets into the attackers, he held the advance for a few more minutes, being wounded in the head in the process. Perilously low on ammunition, he fought on, with a shell exploding directly behind him and lodging a chunk of shrapnel in his back. Bleeding profusely, alone and exhausted, he fired his final rounds, and in a last act of defiance, removed the firing pins from his gun, staggered a few yards forward and threw them into the canal, before collapsing not far from his fallen officer. The bravery of Dease, Godley and many other men, whose names today are forgotten, allowed the Fusiliers to live to fight another day. Over the next few hours, the battered but unbroken men of the BEF made a fighting withdrawal through the town of Mons itself, eventually breaking free of the enemy to begin a withdrawal that would go down in history as the Great Retreat. The Battle of Mons was over. Today, those visiting this remarkable battlefield of the First World War have many moving sights to see. Standing beneath the rail bridge at Nimy is this plaque, commemorating the heroism of Lieutenant Dease and Private Godley, the first two men to receive the Victoria Cross in the Great War. Dease wouldn't live to know it, dying of his wounds just a few yards from where this plaque lies. But Godley would. Against all expectation, months after the action, it was found that Private Godley had not died that day at Nimy rail bridge, but rather had been taken prisoner and brought back from the brink of death by German doctors. He remained a prisoner until November 1918 and eventually returned home to receive his VC from the King at Buckingham Palace in February 1919. Sid Godley died in June 1957, aged 67. Perhaps the most powerful of all places to visit on the battlefield today can be found right here at Saint-Symphorien Military Cemetery, not far from Mons. This unique location is the burial place of many of those, British and German alike, who fought and fell here in August 1914. Amongst them is Oskar Niemeyer, the former gardener from Schleswig-Holstein, who earned fame amongst his comrades on the banks of the canal that day. In the same cemetery lies Maurice Dease, whose own bravery on the same battlefield is remembered to this day. In a strange twist of fate, buried directly behind the first Victoria Cross recipient of the First World War lies George Leonard Price, killed at 10:55 a.m. on the 11th November 1918, the last Commonwealth serviceman to fall on the Western Front. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our look at the final minutes of the war on the Western Front? And for those who enjoy podcasts, there's Not So Quiet on the Western Front, where each week, myself and historian Dr. Spencer Jones explore many of the fascinating and controversial aspects of the Great War. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.